Welcome back to another episode of Sabbath School Boot Camp. My name is Matthew Lucio, and my job is to help you get the most out of your class. Today we're going to be looking at lesson number 1 of the Adult Bible Study Guide. It is called The War Behind All Wars. We're going to be laying out the scriptural foundation for the Great Controversy theme. Now this week is going to be critical in laying the foundation for this entire quarter. So, no pressure on you if you're teaching this week. We've got a lot to talk about, so grab your Bibles, grab your study guide, because Sabbath School Boot Camp starts now. All right, welcome back. On Sunday, we are tackling 3 key passages for the Great Controversy. Now, you could easily spend your entire class just unpacking these 3 key passages. So if you're teaching, manage your time carefully. Let's begin with the first passage. This is Revelation chapter 12, and we're going to begin here with verse 7. It says, "Then war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. But the dragon was not strong enough to prevail, so there was no longer any place left in heaven for him and his angels. So that huge dragon, that ancient serpent, the one called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, was thrown down to the earth, and his angels along with him." Now, when did this war in heaven occur? That's a question that I always wonder when I get to Revelation 12, because if you're reading this chapter through chronologically, then you have to pay attention to the first 6 verses, which all Christians agree talk about Jesus' birth and ascension into heaven. Therefore, this war in heaven takes place after Jesus ascended to heaven, right? Now, there's evidence in the text that this war took place after the cross, and evidence that it is actually a primordial event at or before creation. Why else does John call the devil that ancient serpent, if not to connect this war to the Garden of Eden? And I think John is compressing the timeline here to show how the primordial war in heaven relates to Jesus, and then of course to the church. Now you might be wondering, how could war originate in heaven? This isn't something John came up with or Ellen White imagined. In the apocryphal book of 2nd Enoch, God actually describes the creation of angels and how one of them, named Satanael, is said to have conceived an impossible thought, to place his throne higher than the clouds above the earth, that he might become equal in rank to my power. God in this passage goes on, "I threw him out from the height with his angels." Now, many scholars think this book was written before Revelation, and both 2nd Enoch and Revelation represent a much older tradition of this war in heaven motif. Now, why war? Well, God in 2nd Enoch says that the war started because Satan wanted to be equal with God. Here it draws from the canonical Bible, specifically the other 2 passages we're meant to examine in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. Now these passages make several claims. Number 1, Satan was a good angel who stood by the throne of God. Number 2, his likeness to God, his beauty and wisdom, eventually convinced him that he should be equal with God. Number 3, Revelation tells us that he persuaded other angels to join his cause. Number 4, Revelation 3 suggests that his core complaint was that God wasn't who he says he was, that God wasn't love, but secretly selfish. Now the serpent tells Eve that God doesn't want you to eat that fruit because he doesn't want you to become like him. That is, God is selfish. He's holding you back from your true potential. Given what we read in Isaiah and Ezekiel, it isn't a big leap to conclude that what the serpent told Adam and Eve is basically what he told the other angels in heaven. He wanted to be God, and God said no. And the devil concluded that God said no because God didn't want to share power. God is selfish. He isn't the God of love that he says he is. And so this Satan being gets kicked out, comes to earth, starts the same thing here. Thus we find ourselves in a spiritual war, and the central issue is whether or not God is the kind of loving being he claims to be. Now that is the Great Controversy theme in a nutshell. This is not a unique interpretation that only Adventists hold on to. After all, students of Ellen White have noticed the similarities between her account and the 17th century work Paradise Lost by John Milton. What's more, before Ellen White's ideas on this great controversy were first mentioned in the Advent Review, that is May 27th, 1858, the Review was actually selling a book by H.L. Hastings, a non-Adventist, and it was called The Great Controversy. What's more, Hastings' book was published in Rochester, New York, which is where the Adventist publishing house had been a few years earlier. Curiously, though, Hastings begins his great controversy with sin in the Garden of Eden. It was a great controversy between man and God, not between Satan and God. But I digress. Now, we must be honest and admit that we are piecing something together here, reading between the lines on something the Bible does not spell out explicitly. We are doing what is called theological reasoning. Therefore, most Bible students today don't see Satan in either the Isaiah or the Ezekiel passages, as many Christians used to. Even if modern scholars aren't smitten with this connection, I think there are still compelling reasons to see an allegory to Satan in both of those passages. Like I said, 2nd Enoch makes the connection between Isaiah 14 and Satan. If 2nd Enoch was written in the 1st century, the time of the apostles, then that's a strong indication that Jesus' contemporaries all understood this passage as giving us insight into the fall of Satan. Okay, well, let's move on to Monday and talk about why this rebel angel started his rebellion against God. First, we need to talk about this name, Lucifer. The lesson says, there is no logical explanation for why Lucifer, this perfect angel, should have allowed pride and jealousy to take root in his heart. Now, this name Lucifer actually comes from the King James and the New King James translation of Isaiah 14, verse 12. How you are fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning. Here's the problem. That word Lucifer is a Latin word meaning light bearer. Don't tell Ty Gibson. And it was used in the old Latin Vulgate to translate the word morning star, which was likely a reference to Venus. Side note, God seems to be taunting the devil as the morning star because it rises early over the horizon and then the sun comes out and it disappears. God is basically saying, you're only impressive until I show up. Now, the King James kept the Latin word and turned it into a name, but it was never meant to be the name of the devil. In fact, we don't know his name. We aren't meant to know his name. Lucifer is not his name, but we got to call him something, right? Monday wants us to focus on the fact that this fallen angel had other angels at his command, his seditious ideas persuading others. Now, by pointing us to Revelation 12:4, where the dragon's tail swept away a third of the stars, the lesson means for us to conclude that he deceived about a third of the angels. The text makes it clear that the dragon had swept the stars away in the past and now stands before the woman. Now, I think it could be understood as knocking a third of the angels out of heaven during the war, but it's one of those interpretations you will never be 100% sure of. Speaking of the war, the lesson asks what kind of war took place in heaven. Now, I don't believe this was a physical battle, and as Sigve Tonstad comments on verse 8, which says the dragon was not strong enough to prevail, not being strong enough works as a metaphor that does not measure the two sides by muscle or physical might. A battle of ideas is the best proposition, in which case not being strong enough proves the dragon to have a weak case. Now, this interpretation emphasizes the rationality of the beings God has created. Everyone is allowed to consider this fallen angel's ideas to see for themselves whether it's true. God does not use his power to forcefully prevent his creatures from hearing something contrary to what course he desires for them. The devil failed to persuade most of the heavenly beings that he was right, though he did persuade some, and as a result, he was exiled. On Tuesday, we talk about how this war in heaven didn't end the fight and only moved to a new battlefield, Earth. Knowing how this war in heaven went down, we shouldn't be surprised that God allows Adam and Eve to choose just like the angels. The issue of whether God was who he says he was, whether or not he was love, fundamentally, was on the ballot. And free creatures had the freedom to choose something other than God. That freedom alone should have told everyone who God was, because no petty, selfish tyrant would allow a free and fair vote. So, the serpent comes to Eden to try the same trick with Adam and Eve that he tried in heaven. The serpent made two claims. First, that you won't really die if you eat the fruit. In other words, God lied to you. There are no consequences. He isn't really a God of love. Second, that if you do eat the fruit, you will become like God. In other words, God is holding you back. And if you follow me, you will become like God yourself. That's the serpent's campaign slogan, and it's worth reflecting on how familiar the sentiment is in our world that to follow God is to be held back from your full potential. You're missing out if you follow God. So we need to separate ourselves from God in order to live our best lives. Boy, oh boy, we've heard that a lot. But that's what sin is. It is separation from God. On Wednesday, we look at the consequences of Adam and Eve's separation from God. They hid themselves from God, and God had to go find them. That means that our story is not mankind's search for God, but God's search for us, as Abraham Joshua Heschel put it. When God finds Adam and Eve, there is a short, shall we call it, investigative judgment, where Adam and Eve point the finger elsewhere. But God gives them a promise that a future seed or descendant of the woman will defeat the serpent. Galatians 3:16 interprets Genesis 3:16 to apply it to Jesus. Scripture does not say, and to seeds, meaning many people, but and to your seed, meaning one person who is Christ. Now, I should say that Galatians 3 in context is talking about Abraham's descendants, but since Abraham's descendants are also Eve's descendants, and that the promises made to both of them spoke of a future descendant who would fix everything, I think the interpretation here is warranted. All of this reminds me of the story of Pandora's jar. No, it wasn't a box, okay? In order to punish men, the gods create woman. And I'm not going there at all. Specifically, Pandora was the punishment, and she has a jar. Her name should have been a clue that the gods were up to something, because Pandora means all gifts or all gifted, or we might say only gifts. Nothing bad here, right? Nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. And as you know, the jar gets opened and all sorts of suffering and misery and disease flies out of the jar, but she manages to close the lid and trap the last thing in the jar, hope. Now, if our God was like Zeus, we should have expected him to come down and punish us for ruining his world and choosing the serpent, but he doesn't. Instead, he gives us hope that he will fix all of this. Ours is not the story of vindicating God, but of God vindicating himself in Jesus by rescuing us. Think about it. If the devil's claim was that God wasn't love, that he was secretly selfish, then it is possible that God is just pretending to be good. We can't see him. He could be toying with us, inspiring men and women to live and die for him while he's just laughing in heaven. How could we as human beings really know if this good God act is real or not? Well, by looking at Jesus on the cross, because a selfish God would not die for us. The cross is proof that he is who he says he is, and it's proof that the devil is a liar as well. Because when the devil says that God is a liar and selfish and all that sort of stuff, we see that he's just projecting his attributes onto God. Now let's get to Thursday, because the story doesn't end at the cross, of course. Jesus lives. Hebrews 4 reminds us that we can approach God's throne with confidence because Jesus is our high priest. It says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to empathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin." Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. This is a remarkable text because no Israelite could approach the most holy place of the temple, the room that symbolized God's presence, with anything approaching confidence. On the contrary, only the high priest could approach on one day a year, and it was with extreme caution. But because of Jesus, we can approach God the Father through him. He's our mediator, which was a critical job for the high priest. And when we approach the Father through Jesus, we can receive mercy and grace in our times of need. Hebrews 7 then tells us that Jesus always lives to intercede for us. He never stops. Well, what does that look like? The lesson points us to Jesus' prayer in John 17. If you want to know what Jesus says about us, well, then go read John 17. That's an example of him interceding for us. He is constantly seeking the best possible outcome for us. The promise first made to Eve is still in place. All right, let's go to Friday now, where we wrap all of this up. There are some interesting discussion questions on this page that I want to tackle. First, if God knew both the devil and humans were going to sin, why did he give us free choice? And I think the answer is that God cannot create something that is against his own nature. If he's love, he has to create beings capable of love. As C.S. Lewis said, why then did God give them free will? Because free will, though it makes evil possible, is also the only thing that makes possible any love or goodness or joy worth having. Another question is, why didn't God just kill the devil as soon as he sinned? Wouldn't that have settled the issue? No, it would have proved that the devil was right. Look at these people who criticize Vladimir Putin in Russia and then they mysteriously fall out of a window. Doesn't that lend credibility to their criticism that Putin is a bad guy? God's goal is not to kill sinners, but to stop sin. Because the universe is filled with free moral agents, he doesn't just have to win the war. This is really crucial. He has to win the peace as well. Because if God acts in any way that isn't loving, then he risks sin coming up again and again and again in the future. To kill the devil at the beginning would have proven the devil right. God has to act in a way so that when this whole thing is over, it's over forever, because no free moral agent in the universe would ever choose the devil's path again. All right, that should get you started for this Sabbath. Thanks again for watching Sabbath School Boot Camp. I'll see you next week. Class dismissed.